Hello and welcome to the Car Kernel channel, and welcome to this 2009 Toyota Highlander with 3.5 V6 2GRFE. Super popular engine with a few common problems. Well, the owner of this car wanted all of these problems fixed in one go, and that's exactly what we're going to do in this video. So let's pull this car on the bay, let's pull the engine out of it, and let's take care of all the common problems with it. The 2GR-FE engine, possibly one of the most popular Toyota engines. It's a V6 3.5 liter. It started its life right around 2005 in the Toyota Avalon, and then slowly made its way basically every single model that has a V6, except the Tacoma for the longest time didn't have it, and then eventually it has it. Believe it or not, even the 4Runner that has a 1GR, it's basically the same thing as this one, just slightly bigger displacement, but internally it's exactly the same. This engine was a big change for Toyota when it came out, because they transitioned from the MZ series engine, which is a beautiful engine as well. It was a timing belt engine. This was a timing chain engine. This was dual VVT-I, proper dual VVT-I. It was the first Toyota engine to have hydraulic lifters, and things were very, very advanced. And they had a lot of cutting-edge technology at the time when they came out with this engine. Of course, Toyota being conservative, they kept using it so long. I mean, even in 2022, we still have some models using it. 23, even in the Tacoma, a version of this engine is actually still used. This engine is, for lack of a better word, have matured over time. Initially, when it came out in 2005, it had a lot of issues. I mean, with the Avalon, some of them grenaded when they were newer. They had issues with variable valve timing. This was the first time that they used dual variable valve timing, and they were figuring it out. Never had issues with chains, but it did have issues with VVT-I gears, which is what this car is in for. So this car has a rattling on cold start for a few seconds, then it goes away. That is the problem that brought this car in the shop, and then we kind of saw other issues, and we decided, after consulting with the owner and kind of advising them accordingly, this is a job, if you're going to do it once. One of the biggest Achilles heels of the 2GR-FE is how big it is. Folks, if you compare it size-wise to the 3MZ, 1MZ, the one engines before it, this one is massive. I mean, it's huge. The cylinder heads are very big. The valve covers are huge. Everything is massive. This is a very large V6. So the problem is serviceability. The front timing cover is huge on this engine, and in order to do anything with the chain, you have to pull it. And unfortunately, the way they package it in these cars, you can't really do much with it in the car. You can remove valve covers, yes. You could do, of course, regular maintenance, water pump. Initially, when this engine actually came out, Toyota, and their idea was, for the water pump, you got to pull the engine out to do the water pump. Of course, many methods have been discovered that you can do it without, and they later even adjusted their labor times and everything. But this is one of the things with this engine. If you want to do anything with the timing chain or internal, it has to come out of the car. Can it be done in the car? Yes. Is it worth it? No. Because you're going to potentially have leaks afterwards. Things will not work right. And it's just, you're confined in such a small space. And the best part is, and this is what we're heading into in this video, we are pulling the entire powertrain together. That means engine, transmission, basically half the suspension, everything comes out in one unit. Most people will look at that and be like, this is extensive, this is a lot. And it is. But this is the way the car was assembled. It's actually designed to come out like this. So even though it looks intimidating, looks very intrusive, it's actually not, because, again, folks at Toyota, when they designed this, they designed it in a way where you can drop the entire powertrain in one unit, actually intact, and not really disassemble a lot. I mean, you see this, looks like a lot, but in the mechanics world, This is not a lot. The only thing that they did that was not very well, they wanted you to drop the whole powertrain on a table and then pull the engine out and then do what you need to do. Through experience, the technicians kind of figuring out what we need to do. Initially, the method was drop it on jack stands and do it right there. You could actually almost rebuild the entire engine short of the short block. If you want to do pistons and rings, you'd have to pull it out. But otherwise, if you do it head gaskets, anything with the heads, you don't have to. You can leave it connected to the transmission. And from experience, the 2GR, I think I can count how many times I've seen a 2GR FE or a GR series engine burn oil. It's 100% due to severe neglect. We're not talking about slight neglect. We're talking about, it's been 50,000 miles since the last oil change. That's how bad it needs to be for this engine to burn oil. They're really not known to burn oil, even with extreme miles. The biggest problems with the 2GR FE were, the first problem that came up is the variable valve timing gears. They started coming apart. They changed them. Then they started, after so much time, you get rattle and cold start like this one. And then the other issues were oil leaks, coolant leaks. Not all of them, but the front timing cover is a very common one, especially in the earlier ones. The head gasket leaks, external coolant leaks. This is something I advise this customer, because this is a very expensive job, and we'll talk about costs towards the end of the video, but this is a very expensive job. If you're going to pull this engine out, kind of try to cover everything. So we're doing also a head gasket. We'll show you that. Initially, we're heading into this as the head gasket is not leaking, but we're going to still tackle it, so we're done. Now, more on the job. You notice here I'm taking the glove box off, and the reason for that is this is an early version of this powertrain. So they used to route the wires inside the car for the engine computer. In the newer versions and the newer cars, they started putting the engine computer inside the car, and here's that harness coming out. They started putting it outside the car, and it made things much easier. And something about this job, if you're curious, how do we not forget things? How does things, not forget things to unplug and then plug them back in? There's actually a systematic approach to this. And I feel like the factory also had a similar approach. So we're basically, this is the way I've done it. I've done a lot of these. I mean, as a Toyota technician, you working at a dealership or a specialty shop or whatnot, you would have done a lot of these. And this is just the norm. Yes, we only see the sick ones. There's a lot of them that never get this done to it. But the systematic approach is I start from the driver's side and walk my way around the engine, disconnecting everything at the top, lift the car, get the suspension, which we are doing right now. There's many methods to do this part. Some people drop the whole, like the strut comes down and everything. Some people will separate it. I like to do it this way because it's the least intrusive, and it's the least intrusive on the alignment as well. The alignment does change slightly, but not significant when you do it this way. Now, what I'm cutting right here is the axle nut. This is a little bit of a rusty car, not rusty to a point where we have holes and whatnot, but it's a low-mile car. It's not driven a lot, and it does have rust. It's an older car in Illinois. That's the norm. Just you heat everything up and hope for the best. But as I make my way kind of downstairs is what I call it, so we get the suspension prepped. There's one thing that needs to be done that is a little bit usually the interesting part of this. So the exhaust. Usually exhaust gets really rusty in these cars, and this one surprisingly cooperated. It didn't really give us a really hard time. But the second thing is we're working towards freeing up the oil pans. And the reason we need to remove the upper and lower oil pan, so the oil pump in this car has a relief valve sticking out from underneath. So if you want to remove the front cover, which has the oil pump in it, and this is how the slide Lego starts. If you want to remove the front timing cover, which has oil pump on it, which has that relief valve sticking out from it, it will hit the upper oil pan. So you have to remove the upper oil pan in order to remove the front timing cover. Well, in order to remove the upper oil pan, you have to remove the lower oil pan. And this is how this you have to do this in the car, because if you drop it down, it becomes extremely difficult to access the bottom. And technically, in the book, they want you to suspend the engine up in the car, remove the subframe, and then you can get the lower oil pan. But of course, technicians, through experience, through experimenting, we've discovered that you can actually get the upper oil pan out without really doing anything with the subframe. And that's what we're heading towards here. See, this is where I discovered another thing with these, and we'll talk about it a little bit. The subframe is actually seized to the car, and you'll see us here starting the fight with it. And that's just how these things go. You have to just fight it to break it loose, and then it did come loose eventually, but it's a fight, and that's how it is. You know, you work on cars. Sometimes you try to be gentle with things, and you try to be nice to them. Here we go. It just popped. But sometimes you just have to manhandle things, and it is what it is, especially with rusty cars. Now, as we go through this job, and this is something I teach to the technicians that I work with in the shop, and many apprentices that I've helped in the past when I worked at a dealership. When you're taking a car apart, things might break, especially with rust. That is not your fault. And this is, unless you're really being, not careful or not being, but if bolts break because they're rusty, you can't really do anything about it. All you can do is drill them out, take care of it, secure the car as much as possible, and move on. But when you start assembling the car, whatever breaks is on you because it already came apart. So normally when we deal with rusty cars that we're doing this big job on, you kind of start counting your casualties. And there's a point where if something breaks that we don't have the part for, we need to replace it, there's no really repairing it, you have to go and inform the customer and kind of order parts and get ready, because certain things you can't. Well, a bolt breaks in a metal component, yeah, you can drill it, re-thread it, and we're good. But a component breaks, like for example, the shifter cable is super common to break on these. If that breaks, you can't repair that. You have to replace the shifter cable. And this is the tricky part that, honestly, until I became a shop owner, and I didn't really think about a lot, the conversation with customers about this. And this is, by the way, in the video, going back to it, this is where the biggest fight with the little surprise, we'll talk about it a little bit, the oil cooler line, which is another common problem with this. But going back to the shop owner thing, when something breaks in a car like this, who's paying for it? This is a question that should come up in every owner's mind. Well, here's where this is a tricky subject, because shop owners, there's honest ones, there's ones that are not. This is my philosophy. Don't know if it's right or not, but this is how I do things. If something breaks as we're taking things apart, I think I'm going to share the labor in fixing it. If it's something we can repair, we're not going to charge the customer extra. We'll just take care of it and move on. It is what it is. I guess it's a job hazard. But if it's a component that broke, I'll try to get the customer the best deal I can on the part cost, but they are paying for that cost because I didn't rust the car. It is rusty. Unfortunately, casualties do happen. However, when something breaks going back together, that's 100% on me, because the customer will not hear about this. I will just buy the part or component or spend the time to fix something and move on. Because if something came apart and you go back to put it together and you got a little carried away with the impact there because of lack of experience or whatever, and something broke, well, that's on you. And that's, I think, is my philosophy in the shop, and I think that is fair. We're not going to charge customers extra time to extract bolts that broke. I don't, especially in a job like this. Now we're doing an oil change and a little bolt breaks from a cover. Depends. Sometimes we will advise the customers, hey, this is very tricky to repair. We're going to need extra time. Otherwise, it's staying the way it is. But you got to advise the customer. You can't just leave it the way it is and call it a day or zip tie it together. That's not right, because that gets back to you as a professional. And this is something I have learned as a shop owner. You got to involve the customer. Some shops are afraid to call the customer, tell them, hey, this happened, this happened. No, just tell them and be honest. You're not doing numbers here. This is a car. This is a mechanic's work. Things will come up that you don't anticipate, and I can't quote you from the beginning of things that are going to break. What if they don't break? So this is where this becomes tricky. We are ready to pull the engine out, and this is a cradle. We'll talk about it in a little bit. So I'll let you guys watch the prep. So basically, we lock the pins in the back. This is a two-person job. Yes, lowering the car like this is not something I would try at home, but this is the only way to line it up properly. Lower the car in the cradle and kind of position it and set it up. But let you guys watch the engine coming out, and we'll talk about it some more. We got the engine out. In case you haven't seen it, we've done possibly a couple videos that involved this procedure, never on a Highlander. I think, now that I remember, one of them was. This is a 2G RFE out of a 2009 Toyota Highlander. Beautiful engine to work on, very well engineered. Does have its quirks. This massive job is one of them. In case your blood pressure is already high, I just want to, one disclaimer. The issue with the VVT-I gears in this engine seemed to start seizing around 2010 in some models. By 12, most of them were gone. And this is revision 2 of this engine. The way you know which revision you have, if you have an 05, 06 Avalon, you have the first version, possibly the worst one. And I doubt there's one of them out on the road with the bad VVT-I gears driving, because those literally just came apart, blew up when they were very new. The second revision, which is this one, the way you know it, if you come look at the oil fill hole, if it looks like this, where you can see inside, it's wide open, you have revision 2. Revision 2 did have the VVT-I problem. Some of them don't, some of them do. You get the rattle on cold start. It's pretty deep rattle that goes away after a few seconds. I want to say one thing about the 2GR that I get this question a lot. These engines, when they're cold, especially revision 2, they will make a noise like a clattering that goes away completely when the engine warms up. But it's not a few seconds and it goes away. No, it stays there until it warms up. That is normal for these. It is piston slap. That's how they are, but it doesn't mean that it's going to get damaged down the road. No, you will see examples of revision 2 with hundreds of thousands of miles and they run perfectly fine. And they've been doing that since day one. Revision 3, the oil cap, when you open it, you'll have 2 slits, but the whole thing is closed. That is revision 3. With revision 3, you do not have VVT-I issues at all unless you run it low in oil. And things are much better. Even the clattering sound, they did a few things to limit it or make it very low. Having said that, 2GRs can develop VVT-I issues after their third revision from poor maintenance. 10,000 mile oil changes, or every 2 years we're going to decide to do an oil change. You'll start with VVT-I problems, usually rattling noises when they're warmed up, and all of a sudden it starts rattling, clattering, and then it goes away, and eventually leading to codes and issues. Let's get back to this job though, because this is one of the more challenging ones. This is a rust belt car. I mean, everything is super rusty, even though this is a low mile car, but it has a lot of rust, and that's inevitable around our area. Let's talk about the first challenge. The first challenge was getting some of these bolts, and I was super nervous about it. The first bolt that almost caused a catastrophe was the shift cable. So the shift cable goes through here, and it has a 12 millimeter nut right there. And the end of that looks like this. So basically, I am trying to get this nut off. And these have a tendency, when they're rusty, to break the cable. And if you break the cable, now you're tearing half the interior apart to replace it. Got lucky, came out. You can't really heat this up, because you heat this up, this heat transfers to the seal behind here. And if you look at this nut, how rusty it is, that's not gonna happen, none of these. You try to take this off, it breaks the shaft. Now we're tearing this transmission apart to replace the shift shaft. We do not want that. So this is where you have to kind of, what do we sacrifice? This is the problem with rust. Then possibly the biggest problem we had was the subframe. Jose, if you come around, and we'll show them this. Do you see the little ding mark here? The subframe was seized onto the body. This is very common on Siennas. Some Highlanders, especially when they get older like this, they love to seize right here, and now you can't separate the subframe from the car. So you notice, I don't know if you caught it in the time lapse, Jose was prying down on it, and I put a pickle fork right here with an air hammer. These are the two marks you see. The pickle fork goes here, which is usually used for like tie rods, ball joints, whatnot. It pushes it down with force, and it pops it from the body, and then we're good. It's always this size that seizes. This is the passenger rear side. The driver's side, I've never really seen one seize, and you look, this one does have a little bit of rust, but it's overall, I'm talking about the inside, overall it's clean. Doesn't really have much rust. When you compare it to this one is all coated, and it just looks horrible inside. So that was the other one. The next casualty we have because of rust was the axle. One of them. Passenger axle came right out. Driver's axle. The axle nut had so much rust just built into it that you take it out, it just chews up the thread. This happens all the time, folks. This is nothing new, no surprise. It's basically a 50-50 chance. So what we do in this case, we rethread this. It's a very difficult process because we have to lock the axle, and sometimes I end up removing it, and we get a really good die and rethread it. I've had good success with them. Very rare cases where it just won't hold and I don't feel comfortable. We're just going to put an axle. Another rust belt special. If you look here, you see this. It looks like the axle is just cracking. Folks, that's just the paint or the coating on the axle just coming up. There's nothing wrong with this axle. We're not going to go replacing half the car because things look like that. If you see that, don't be concerned. I mean, I will show you. This is just the coating. We got solid steel underneath it. So this is not a big deal. Of course, there's the little odds and ends. One exhaust stud got rounded off. But the biggest thing that was a huge red flag from the moment I saw it was the oil cooler line. In case you're not familiar, this engine has a notorious habit of blowing up rubber oil lines. So Toyota over the years, they kind of updated, and things were good. Let's look at the first one. So this line right here, this is a VVT-I line. This is what feeds the valve cover so it could feed the gears. This line used to have a rubber section right here. This one doesn't have it. You would see the rubber like up to here. You'll see it. This one doesn't have it. But then there is the oil cooler line, which is notorious to be rubber in the older models section of it, and it gets brittle, starts leaking. I mean, within a matter of minutes, it'll empty this engine of oil, and it would destroy the engine, which would have otherwise ran for hundreds of thousands of miles. But my concern with this car is somebody in their infinite wisdom decided to put an aftermarket, yes, aftermarket oil cooler line. The first problem is it is horrendous. I mean, just the quality, look how rusted it is already. I am yet to see one of the replacement metal ones rust like this. The second problem is, you try to take this bolt, do you see how this line is in your way? It's not even welded right. So I basically, on this side, I don't even know how they installed it. I had to destroy it to get one of these bolts out where we're starting to round off. Of course, we're not going to do all this job and put this disgusting thing back. That's going to the garbage. We're putting a new one, $77 or there on about for the part. It's kind of an obvious choice, but the biggest thing is whoever installed it, and I wonder how it didn't leak. I mean, look at this sealer. They put sealer. There's supposed to be a gasket here. They put sealer, and there's strings of it all over the place. And I wonder if we have anything on the pickup. We do have a little bit of like sealer remnants. I see it as gray. That's what they decided to do. That's okay. This is not bad. We'll clean all that up. But then this is something I saw afterwards that I did not notice when we were taking this engine apart. Look at this idler. Super common for this engine, for this idler to start making noise and cause all kinds of issues. You get replaced, and Toyota actually redesigned it. Somebody missed half of it, and you see how it's just sitting on the edge? That is not a good idea. I mean, you install a bolt, you see it sticking out this much. At least look. It's actually missing a little washer, kind of looks like this, because this is a new style. what are you gonna do? I guess it ran this long. We're gonna replace this water pump. Unknown if this water pump is even original, possibly. This car does have a little bit of a front timing cover leak. That's how that looks like close up. Not terrible. Not terrible, but you can see it starts to leak right at the corner right here. But we got this far. We're going to take care of all these issues. And this is what the owner of this car kind of wanted. They wanted to keep this car, because the car otherwise, it's in beautiful shape. I mean, it's in really good shape. They wanted to tackle this job once. And initially, they just wanted to do the VVT-I gear. If we're going to go that far and spend that much, this engine also have a tendency of having head gasket leaks external. Over time, rust, especially rusty land, the head gasket material itself gets salt in it and it starts to separate, and then we have external head gasket leaks. I told him, if we're going to go this far, let this be the last time this engine is out in this car's life. We're going to pull the heads out, we're going to do all that and take care of everything. Before we start the job, and because this is just starting the start, I suppose, we just pull the engine so we can tear it down. In case you haven't seen it, this is the engine bay of a 2009 Highlander. Another casualty that was not really a casualty, it was just something I found. So these Highlanders have this wire, which is for the wiper heaters. It was already broken. I can't really do much about it. You basically have to replace the glass. So I'm just going to let the owner know, hey, if you wondered why these were not working, here is that. But here's the plan. These are all the parts. I actually got this little shelf just to not put stuff on the floor and they get thrown around and whatnot. We're going to tear this engine down. So we're going to pull the valve cover, pull everything, pull the front cover, pull the heads off, and then we'll catch you guys back up when it's all torn down. We'll take a look at everything, then show you the action plan as we start to assemble it. We'll go from there. So tearing the 2GR once it's out of the car is a very simple proposition. We start with the throttle body, which you saw removed here. Now I'm working my way towards the plenum. Many folks dislike the plenum that wraps around and makes the rear spark plugs really difficult to change. Well, they're not very difficult right now when the engine's out of the car. Common joke is, hey, this is an easier way to do the spark plugs. But there's also a systematic approach here. So we pull the plenum because it covers the rear valve cover. And it's very important that, you see what I'm putting tape here? If you drop bolts here, they can go stuck by the valves and cause really big issues. So next thing is I'm removing the belt. And you notice I'm starting from the very bottom. We're basically working our way towards getting the wire harness out. And the reason I removed the compressor, there's a crank sensor right behind it. Then the alternator comes out to give us some space. We're removing the entire wire harness because we want to remove the valve covers. There's a common thing, unfortunately, in the Toyota technician world. Some technicians decided that we could remove the front timing cover without removing the valve covers. Folks, you cannot do that. That is not a good idea. So we're removing all the harness slowly. You know, some of these connectors are brittle, so you got to be a little gentle with them. Slowly remove them. Because the plan is we want to pull the valve cover, which overlaps the front timing cover, and then we're working towards removing the front timing cover, which once the front timing cover is off, we're pretty much inside. We start with the chain and everything, and you'll see this entire process unfold. The harness is different on this. There's multiple versions of the harness, depends which revision. This is the oldest one and basically the original one. They didn't change it until later. But here's that harness off. Next, we're gonna get some of the front items off, like the idler, the belt tensioner. It actually wraps behind the compressor. Not the greatest idea, but that's how they did it. So this is the thermostat housing coming off. There's another hose, the bypass hose that goes underneath the intake manifold. A little bit of a fight. Some of these haven't been off for a very long time. Then we remove the two lines for the VVT-I gears. We'll talk about the one line that is also a common problem with this engine, but this one doesn't have it. Organizing these parts in a way that you're going to assemble them, because the assembly is exactly the same way. Here's that other line. And we're working our way towards that valve cover. The valve cover on the 2GR is huge, and it does have kind of guide pins, so you got to be careful when you remove it, because if you just remove it with force, it could crack and break, especially with a rusty one. You notice I'm slowly walking around. Here's that first valve cover, and then the next one. So the 2GR is built in a way where it became kind of the golden standard of all. You'll see the 2AR is exactly the same, and we call it basically a baby 2GR. It's a 4-cylinder that is exactly the same way as the 2GR, the original 2GR. We set the timing here. If you're just doing a front timing cover, you don't need to do this because the tensioner is internal. We're removing the water pump. You can remove the water pump as part of the front timing cover, but I like to remove it, get some of that coolant out. And here we are pulling the front timing cover, and it's pretty simple at this point. You see how big it is? It's massive and it's wide. So there's that. Now we start pulling some of the timing components. Chain is coming off. So in this case with this customer, we are replacing the timing chains, and I am going to remove them in a way where we're replacing the gears, of course. These are the timing gears, and we'll talk about them a little bit later when we start assembling. But we pull it as one unit together with the chain, and then the tensioner, the guides, everything comes off as one unit because we are replacing. If you're just doing a head gasket, you don't actually need to remove them. You can leave them on and remove the cam tower, which we're going to move on to removing next. The cam tower is the second upper part of the cylinder head. This is what houses the cams, and you can actually remove it with the cams, and that's what we're doing right here. You'll see that come off right now. The bolts are the same. You don't have to worry where they go, but here we're removing the lifters, the valve caps, and we'll talk about all of these in detail. The hydraulic lifters are there. These technically don't have to go back exactly where they are, but because this is an in-service engine, you do want to put them back exactly where they go. That's why I'm arranging them in the way, because the rollers will wear to the cam and things will wear together. You want to keep them in the same space as much as possible. So the last thing we have after we do this side and then the next side, here I decided to remove the exhaust manifold. It needs to come off for the cylinder head to be ready. Then we move on to the intake manifold. Intake manifold on 2GR is very simple. Underneath the intake manifold is the knock sensors and the wire, and there's a bypass tube. So again, here I am putting more tape just to prevent things from falling in, although we're taking the heads off and cleaning them. But still, the less debris we create, the better. And we move on to the bypass pipe in the back. This is a very simple pipe. This is the pipe that on the latest revision of the 2GR it became a plastic one, and it did cause some issues, and especially in 17 Tacoma. But we're removing the other side exhaust manifold, which is pretty simple, very simple when it's outside the car. This manifold is actually a little bit more difficult when the car is assembled, but here, of course, it's very simple. Everything is going very well at this point. You know, they were past the rusty stuff, so your internal things are coming apart. Here's that other cam tower coming off. Very simple. You just have to be gentle. It does have sealer. You'll see that in assembly. It's pretty simple. Again, we're doing the same thing on this side with the lifters, the valve cap, and the roller rockers. Arranging these, very important. Cleanliness here starts, we're inside the engine now. You got to keep things arranged. You got to keep things clean. And kind of take your time checking everything as we go. I usually like to remove an entire component, then check everything. We don't do that on camera because I just take my time, look at everything, measure stuff, and just make sure everything is good. Although this is an in-service engine, so it ran perfectly fine other than the rattle, but still, we're at this point. Here's that cylinder head coming off. Here's the first one, head gasket, and then the second one. The second one, we did have a little incident, and you will see it in a little bit, and we'll talk about it some more as we go. But everything's going pretty smooth. Here's that incident. Everything's going pretty smoothly. So we're going to get back to the live video, and actually this is the end of the first day. So we'll catch you guys back on the live video on day 2. It is the next day, and we had a little incident. I don't know if you caught it on the time lapse there. We tried to slow it down a little bit. So when I was taking the last head bolt, the whole cradle shifted. This is the second time this happens to me in well over 1,000 that I've done of these. This is the second time this happens, and the reason it happened is when I'm taking the bolt off, it torques the whole subframe. That's how tight these head bolts are. It torques the whole subframe, and it comes off the pin and it turns. Now, right now we have it tied down with the tie strap just to keep it here. Eventually use a cherry picker to set it back in place, although it's pretty stable because it's still sitting on the platform. Still, I want to get it properly positioned, because if we install it right now, I don't think we're going to be able to install this back bolt right here, because if you come see it, it's kind of blocked by the platform. Can I just say one thing about Toyota? Up until recently, there was no tool to do this. I guess they just didn't think that we needed a tool like this. So this platform, two companies use it as a special tool. This particular platform, you notice, is blue. It's actually from GM when they had the 3.6 and the Traverse. Actually, GM technicians call it the Traverse mount because that was the first engine to have chain failure and they would be dropping them left and right. And this is a GM official tool, and then there's a Nissan version of it. It's silver, I believe, or gray. So Toyota doesn't have that. Until recently, we have the platform that kind of comes down. It's meant for batteries, but technicians started using it for this. This, I think, is the best way to drop the cradle. You could move it easily, position it easily. But going back to the engine, so I told this customer, let's do head gaskets, because if we're going to go that far, we're going to put the VVT-I gears. We want to make sure that this is the last time this engine comes down. And would you look here? Head gasket leak, external. Very small. Now, this car was all together, and I saw this. I'd probably tell the owner of this car, hey, we're going to possibly wait for it to get a little bigger, because this was very, very small. I mean, you could barely see it, but it was eventually going to get bigger, and that's how this goes. But let's look more at this engine. Now, this engine has right around 98,000 miles or so. Look at these cylinder walls. Just beautiful. They look absolutely beautiful. Both sides. It's just in excellent shape. Pistons are not even carboned up. Everything just looks beautiful. Now, what we're going to do here, this is not a car that has issues. This is what I call an in-service engine. So we're going to clean the deck very lightly. Same thing with the cylinder head. We're not going to go, oh, let's send this resurface. This is a perfectly running engine. And when you see this coolant leak, here's exactly why this coolant leak happened. Do you see this black material right here? That black material is a coating on the head gasket. And let me show you the corresponding head gasket. I believe it is this one, just by looking at it. No, this is not the one, it's the other one. So if we look at the exact area, this is how that cylinder head gasket goes. This is the area that was leaking. If you look here, you see how this is coming apart? This doesn't look too bad. If I flip it, see how it's all deteriorated? That's why these things leak. So what happens, salt gets in here and kind of bubbles it up and makes the passage through. As soon as it hits the edge of the coolant jacket right here, it has a perfect pass and it starts leaking. Let's look at the other side on the same area of the cylinder. You see how the same thing is happening here? But it hasn't leaked yet. I mean, look at this. This was on the way to become the next leak. Didn't leak, so that's good. But I just talked to the customer. We got the okay on a few additional stuff that I wanted to show you. The first thing is the belt tensioner. I hope you can hear that on camera. That doesn't sound too good. And some people will say, well, why don't you just replace the pulley? Well, the pulley comes part of the tensioner. You can't really buy it OEM, just the pulley and not the tensioner. So I'm not going to buy a tensioner just to put the pulley. That's not a good idea. We're just going to get a tensioner, call it a day. The next one is, once I find it, I put it somewhere. That little idler. It is somewhere here. It's missing a washer in the front. It doesn't make noise, but it's missing a washer. It was improperly installed. We're not going to take chances. We're going to replace it. We're going to call it a day. Well, let me show you a few more things. We'll take a look at all the intimate parts of the 2GR. Knock sensors right here. Nothing wrong with the knock sensors. What I love about the 2GR versus the 1GR, the 1GR, this pipe sits higher and it kind of covers these. And you can't really get to them. On the 2GR, they raised them up, so they're much easier to access. You just remove the intake manifold, and they're right here with the wire. This sprocket is a timing chain sprocket. Did you know that this sprocket gets this rubber part right here? You see how the chain imprints into it? It's possibly hard to see on camera, but the chain imprints, if you look at it right in this angle, it imprints on this. You see the slots? When you go to install this, you will have to line up the links of the chain with the imprints. If you don't, you could actually vibrate the chain enough where it sets a code for timing code. Basically, timing is off, correlation code. This is very important. This sprocket is getting replaced. And when you do replace it, because now it's an even new rubber round, you're not going to have any issues because the new chain, as soon as you run the car and heats up a little bit, it's going to make a new imprint on it, and we're good. This is one of the quirks, if you would, of the 2GR FE. Very simple engine. Looks very complicated. It's actually pretty simple, because I keep saying that, but it is compared to other engines. This is cylinder head. Let's look at the valves here. Very clean valves. Folks, when you see valves that look like this is a healthy engine. You don't have oil burning, you don't have excessive carbon buildup, and this looks just beautiful. When we looked at it, we already checked the cylinder heads, but we are replacing the spark plugs while we are here. But would you look at this black material? See, when you go to clean this, you have to get this stuff off. This comes right off with the razor blade. And I usually clean them very light. Nothing, remember, this is a machine surface. You can't really go too much on it. Same thing with the other cylinder head. And we haven't gotten this far on video with VVT-I gears. I wanted to show them to you close. So here's what happens with the rattle on cold start. These are the two gears. This is the exhaust one. This doesn't have a lock pin. Do you see this big spring? That's what locks it when you shut off the car. But this one does have a lock pin, and the lock pin starts to not lock properly, and that's why they rattle. So most of the rattles are from the intake. But the exhaust on the 2GR, and this is an old style one, this middle sleeve loves to start walking its way out. Now these two, this one has a little bit of a walk, this other side. This one not so much. Let me bring it and you can see it. You see how this one is starting to walk out? You see the little shadow? So here's what happens in the end of these. This middle part will walk its way all the way out until it starts contacting the inside of the front timing cover, and it starts making one sharp metallic noise. I mean, now you have metal to metal contact. Eventually, this will pop out completely, and this whole gear will grenade and wipe out this entire engine. This was the problem with revision 1 of this engine. This happened in like 30,000 miles. This thing would just pop out, the whole thing would grenade. They immediately fixed it. It actually didn't take long for them to fix this, and it was a revised thing from the factory, and we didn't have any issues. Now the newer ones, if you run this engine low on oil, even a little bit, this will pop out immediately. That is the thing with these. As soon as this gear runs on and it starts rattling, it'll push this out. This even happens with the newer revisions of this engine. Obviously, any engine you run it low in oil, it's going to have issues, but this is the first issue. And we've seen cars, when the oil cooler line goes, they'll start having a heavy metallic rattling. It's from this popping out, hitting the front cover, eventually coming off, and the whole thing just grenades. Let's look at the rest of this engine. This is a cam cradle, or cam tower. We love to call it that, Toyota technicians. This basically is just the top piece of the cylinder head, sits right here on top of the cylinder head. This is what houses the cams, and you notice you don't even have to remove the cams from it. You can remove it in one unit. This over here, these are hydraulic lifters right here. These are the roller rockers, and then this is just the valve tip cap. So what happens here, This is how this is sitting, and the valve is here. The cam pushing on this to open the valve and close it. So when the car is cold, this gap will be bigger. The hydraulic lifter will come up and close this gap. As the engine warms up, this will actually push the lifter down and it'll collapse. It'll keep the valve clearance correct. That's how hydraulic lifters work in a few seconds. We have a lot of cleaning left. I mean, we have all, this is sealer. You see the sealer right here. This is all put together with sealer. All the sealer needs to be cleaned. The back of these need to be cleaned. The cylinder heads need a lot of cleaning. We have a cleaning festival, let's put it this way. This is probably the longest part of this job, is the cleaning. Cleaning, make sure everything is clean before you install it. So we're gonna start the cleaning. We're gonna do that off camera. I mean, it's extremely boring to watch. Just cleaning, cleaning, cleaning. It's not like we're gonna shine everything up. We just wanna make sure it doesn't leak or anything. But we're gonna put you guys back on the time lapse after we do all the cleaning. We're gonna assemble this engine. We're gonna talk about a few more things. I will stop at the part where we do the timing chain. Go back to the live video so we can show you the nice new VVT-I gears and the chain and the whole, all the components. So let's start putting it together and we'll go from there. So now that you have made it past the difficult audio part, apologies for that, folks. You know, I'm focused on working on the car and we're focused on getting the video. The microphone died, so 8 to 10 hours later, me and Jose figured out the voiceover, so apologies for that section once more, but it's smooth sailing from here on out, because this is when we discovered that the microphone was dying. Moving on from this, so the head bolts. Something important about head bolts, you check their length, and these are stretch bolts, so there's a point where there's actually a specification for them. They were all good, so we are reusing the same head bolts. Again, this is an in-service engine that doesn't have overheating or issues like that. So specific sequence and something about these head bolts, you put an initial torque and then there's degrees, and that's the stretch. You can't just torque them to a specific torque and that's it. You have to stretch them, and that's the 90 degrees. I believe in the 2GR it's 290 degrees. Don't take me for that. Always check your repair manual. And the best part about the repair manual, this is a newer car, so the repair manuals in this era were actual assembly manual. In the old times, they show you how to take an engine apart, and then you open the installation instructions. They just tell you reverse order of removal. That was not a very good thing. So we are assembling now the valve train. I put some oil. We did not bleed these or kind of collapse these lifters, so they still have oil in them. You just put, if I found from experience, if you put a little bit of oil on top of them, they don't clatter. Sometimes they clatter a little bit, then they're fine. So we're assembling all that. We're getting ready to install our cam towers. That'll be the last thing. And then we'll go back to actually a live video. I'll show you the new components and how they're good with good audio this time. Putting a sealer here, put the cam tower, torque it down. This is, again, you're compressing the cams now, so you got to torque them in a specific order. And things are pretty much smooth sailing from here on out. The cleaning was the longest part. I didn't add it in the video. It's basically just repetition. One thing on the cleaning part, and this is important, if you ever work with a sealer, so Toyota sealer is called Fippage. That's the name Toyota technicians use. It's called form in place gasket. You got to clean the surfaces really well. I like it a lot more than gaskets. People dislike the sealer. If you prep well for the sealer, I haven't had issues. Occasionally you'll have failure here or there, but normally if you clean it well, you don't use power tools, you kind of take your time in the cleaning. Just like any job, prep is 90% of the success of the job. You clean well, you take your time, make sure there's no oil, and everything goes from here. Now we're cleaning the residue of the intake manifold gasket. Anytime you have a black gasket on Toyotas, you do want to clean any residue left. That is very important. So we're putting the intake manifold back, and we're going to go back to installing the timing chain, which we're going to do live. Not the actual installation, but like explaining how the chains route and how things are. So we're almost there. Let's go back to the live video, and we'll talk about it. We are ready to assemble the timing components. And right now, I don't have any of the chains or everything. If you look here, this is how everything looks Pre-assembly. Got the cams, but not the cam gears. This sprocket, which by the way, in case you did not know this has imprints on it. When this gets replaced, the new one will be flat, and as you run the engine and the chain, it'll actually imprint on the new one, and we're good. But let me show you something cool about the timing gears. If I can find a couple. This is the exhaust one, the new one. So the exhaust on both sides are the same gear. And here's how they did that with timing. Let me pull the intake. Here's the intake one. It's also the same on both banks. So if you look here, you have a 1 dot and 2 dots. And if you look on the exhaust one, we have line and then 2 lines. So this corresponds to the banks. Let me find a chain here, and I'll show you how that's going to go. So this is a little chain, one of 2. The chain is actually exactly the same. So let's say we're assembling bank 1, which is the rear bank. We're going to install the chain on mark number 1 on this gear, and then mark number 1 on this gear. So right now, if you look at this chain with the link, it's on mark number 1, and this is mark number 1. This is ready to be installed for bank 1. If we were going to go bank 2, which is the other side, we're just going to move this gear here, move this one to the second mark. And you see how this one now is on the second mark and the 2 lines. That's how you know this gear is timed. It's a pretty simple idea. That it's really a smart, very smart idea. So another thing that we're going to change here is all the mini tensioners. These little tensioners are for this chain. They sit in the middle. They kind of sit right here on the engine. One of them sits here and the other one sits right here, and it just pushes this little chain out, and then the main chain tensioner is here. This is a little bit of a tricky installation of everything to make sure everything is right. I'm going to put you guys back on the time lapse. As we go back into the time lapse, let's talk about first the cost of this job. Make sure you are seated for this one, because this one is a big one. We've been working on this car for 4 days at this point, and it's a big job, as you can see. And the parts, Toyota parts, are extremely expensive. So as you are seated down, this job costs just over $7,000. Now, many of you will jump in the comments, this is worth it, this is not. We will talk about that in a little bit. First, let's break down the cost. So labor is 22 hours. And yes, it is well over 4 days, but it is 22 hours. That's what the book calls for it. That's what we're going to do. If we take extra time dealing with some of the aftermath stuff, like the axle threading and whatnot, odds and ends, we're not going to put that on the customer. That's how these jobs work. Now, the gasket kit for the engine is just over $600. The VVT-I gears for the intake, they are $368 each. So there's 2 of them. That's $700 and almost $40. The exhausts are $431 each, total of $862 some change. And then the main timing chain is just over $300. The little timing chains, there's 2 of them. Both of them are $192. One guide is $128, another guide is $46. Then the little sprocket in the middle is $22. The chain tensioner is $102. Another chain tensioner is $102, and the third chain tensioner is also $102. Then another chain guide, there's 2 of them, those little ones in the middle. They're right around $28 each. 2 gallons of coolant at $51. Oil, $45. There's cleaner that we use to clean multiple components. It's right around $25. There's 1 tube of sealer that is just over $20. Oil filter is almost $6. Water pump, $181. Belt tensioner, $282. One of the idlers is $85, and there's a little washer that was missing for the idlers. That's just under $4. Oil cooler line was $78. There are a couple clips that secure one of the covers. We ended up getting a couple of them. They're specialty clips. They're $20. Spark plugs were just over $100. And then another washer for one of the idlers came out to just over $3. Folks, Toyota parts are extremely expensive, especially when it comes to timing. I mean, most of these components last a very long time, and I know this car is low miles. Customer wanted new chain. Would we have been fine using the old chain? Probably, but they did not want to take a chance. They wanted a new chain. It is their car, their decision, which takes us to, is this worth it? Now, normally, when a customer comes in the shop and we talk about a job like this, I'd like them to think about it for a minute because this is a lot of work. In this particular case, it was not a dire case where it was coming apart and rattling continuously. It does rattle on cold start. We verified it. If the car sits over 8 hours, it rattles pretty heavy, as you heard it when we talked about it earlier in the video. But this particular case, I have to say this. The customer did not come in for a diagnosis. They kind of knew what was wrong with the car. They've done the research. They wanted the job done. And normally, I like to tell customers, think about it. Here's a total. Here's an estimate. It's a lot of money. You need to run your numbers. You need to make sure. But this particular case, they've already done the research. When they came through the door, they wanted this done. Now, the car otherwise, you've seen it does have some rust, but the car is actually in excellent shape. The body's clean. The interior's clean. I don't see anything falling apart. Suspension is good. Brakes have just been replaced not too long ago. Things are in good shape with this car. It drove like and basically a new Highline. I remember when these were new. This is one of the cleaner ones we've had. Rust is normal in our area. Some folks might have issues with rust, but this is pretty normal for our area. So whether it's worth it or not, I feel like in this case, the owner of this car was determined. He knew what he was going into. I feel like he ran his numbers before he even came in and asked for this job because he was very specific about asking what he wanted to do. I talked to him a little bit about the chain. He says, I just want it done. I don't want to have any issues. I want every single common problem taken care of. And some of them I do have. Some of them we're going to take care of while we're there, like the head gasket got added on later. But let me talk to you about what do you do if you have some of these common problems. The first thing is the oil cooler line is a very important line that you check. And just to note, because we've done a few videos on the oil cooler line, and I want to clarify one thing. Not all 2GRs will have the oil cooler line that loves to rupture, the rubber one. Some of them won't have an oil cooler at all. Like if you have a Camry V6, Avalon V6, just for a few examples, and an ES350, you're not going to have an oil cooler. These do not have oil coolers. The cars that do are cars that are capable of towing. Like you have a Sienna, you have a Highlander, RX350, Venza. Those are the ones that are going to have the oil cooler. Therefore, they might have the oil cooler lines that are still rubber. So if you do have some of the older 2GRs, these specific cars, do check. But even those, you can have a model that does not have the oil cooler at all. So you won't have the line if you don't have the oil cooler. Now, the other VVT-I line, if your car is older than 2010, you possibly will have the little rubber section. There was a campaign to replace the little rubber section, so if that's been done, you're okay. But if you want to, you're in there. If you have a case of a power steering pump, you're replacing it, do replace that line because it's right there if you remove the power steering pump. In cases of it doesn't, like a Highlander that doesn't have a power steering, you might want to replace it if it's something you're in doubt. They're not very difficult. It can be DIY if there's no power steering pump. If there is a power steering pump, it's a little bit more difficult. Then the head gasket. You saw this one. We actually went into it thinking we're doing this kind of while we are there, but it ended up being it does have a small leak. In the 2GR head gasket leaks, they vary. If you have a mysterious coolant leak, you don't really see it leaking anywhere. No radiator, no hoses, nowhere else. Not a water pump. Water pump is notorious on these engines, by the way. If you see that, you might have a coolant leak in the valley. So the coolant leaks in the valley are very difficult to find unless you really look for them. You got to send the camera in there to see. You'll see a lot of coolant crust. Eventually, when the leak gets big enough, you'll actually see it leaking on the ground. And in the case where the head gasket leaks externally, usually most of the time it seems like always the same spot in the back, you'll see coolant dripping on the floor, and it gets that bad. But if it's a little tiny piece of crust, just keep an eye on it, keep keep the coolant topped off until it gets big enough, because some of these take a long time for the coolant leak to become big. And the other thing is the VVT-I rattle. Let's talk about that for a minute, because this is a pretty expensive job. There's no way around it. Nothing really you can do other than take the engine down and replace the VVT-I gears. Here's the criteria from experience. If you have a VVT-I gear that rattles only when you leave the car over 8 hours, like let's say you leave it overnight, rattles a little bit, then it stops. This is what I will call phase one. You're on caution. This is something that's going to come up on the radar, but we're only going to tackle this job if it becomes like every other start, like you leave the car for an hour or two and it rattles, then we're a little bit on higher alert. Now we've moved to phase two, where things are progressing. If you start getting this rattle on every start, this becomes kind of code red. We need to get this done as soon as possible. If you run this engine low on oil, even for a short period of time, like if the oil cooler line popped, and the way they pop, you're driving and all of a sudden it starts leaking oil so fast, by the time you pull over safely, it's already low on oil. In this case, the gears will get so loud that even when you start the car, it'll rattle and rattle and rattle for a good 2-3 minutes before it stops, and sometimes they won't stop. If you get to that point, that will be the only point I would advise you to avoid driving the car, because you could cause serious damage and basically end the life of this engine, and explore your options. If you run a 2GR low on oil, you are likely better off, and we've had this, I've done a video before on one of these, you're likely better off looking at used engines. I will just honestly say the truth, because the 2GR doesn't have oiling problems, but running low on oil, or not only have VVT-I problems, they love to wipe out bearings and many other things. One note on the 2GR FE, another characteristics that it have sent people on kind of a scare. These engines are noisy when they're cold. And this engine typically is on the noisier side. It just clatters. That's how it is. However, we've seen a trend of continuous bad maintenance. You're doing oil changes every 20,000 miles and always late on the oil change, using the cheapest oil and horrible oil filters, and oil filters in another one. They tend to develop kind of a clattering noise. As the engine is running, all of a sudden it starts clattering, then it stops. That's actually VVT-I problems from contamination. There are a couple filters. You could try to clean them, but most of the time, if the filters are clogged, the damage is already done, and unfortunately, that's the reality of this. The only problem with the 2GR is anything with the chain, engine has to come out of the car. That is the only problem. And labor times, they're basically anywhere from 16, 17 hours and goes up. The most difficult 2GR to do is the one in the RAV4, like 2006 all the way to 2012. That is the most difficult 2GR to pull out, and it's actually the smallest car, the most complicated subframe, and it makes this job extremely more complicated. And these cars are older, usually owners, if they have big issues, they'll just move on from the whole car. Easiest ones to do are probably the ones that don't have a power steering. And the newer you get, like you get into a 15 Sienna with a front timing cover leak, or just a leaking head gasket. Usually this is what these have. These are the lowest on the labor cost, although some Sienna all-wheel drive will get it up. Again, you have all-wheel drive, you have oil cooler, the labor cost will go up because there's more stuff to take out. We are wrapping up this job, and we are staying really late for this one to get it done, because we were a little behind on this project, because we had to wait for some parts, and the customer wanted the car back. But we're almost at the end. They're about to start adding some fluids here and get ready for the grand start. And I was really happy with how this job turned out. We had some complications here and there with the axle and whatnot, but everything turned out pretty well. Jobs like this, no matter how many you do of them, when you get to that final start, it's still a little nerve-wracking, but I'm glad everything went smoothly with this one. We checked it. Car's been gone with the shop for a while. We haven't had issues. We usually have the cars come back after 1,000 miles or so. Just make sure none of the hoses we moved, nothing's leaking, everything looks good. Just kind of a courtesy check before we start going on road trips and whatnot, because believe conversation with this customer is they intend to use it for road trips. They want to use the car without having to worry about these issues. And without further ado, we're about to start it for the first time. So let's go back to that live video as we fill up the coolant here, and you'll hear it run once more. The moment of truth is here. After all this work, is this gonna start? Is it gonna run? Now, this is a moment that every mechanic kind of, done all this work. This is the moment of, you start double questioning yourself and kind of second guessing, if you would. But I've been through this a lot. I've done a lot of these engines. I'm gonna count on my experience, and we're just gonna hope for a blessing, and we're gonna turn the engine over and hope it starts. Big disclaimer, the engine might make all kinds of rattling noises. That is completely normal when you've taken it apart. 2GR does not have a mechanically locking VVT-I gear, so it's gonna rumble a little bit or not. We'll find out. Let's go start it, see how she runs. All right, no rumble. A little bit of rumble from the lifters. That is also normal after you remove them. I don't see any major leaks. Well, that's good. This means we didn't forget anything. Hey, look at that. It's alive. It really makes me happy. So I do hear the lifters ticking a little bit. That is pretty normal after you remove them. Even though we try to pump them up with oil and everything, they'll still tick a little bit, then it goes away after the engine warms up. But we are far from done. For you guys, we're done, but for us, you notice there is a lot missing still. I usually like to run the cars when we do a big engine job like this. You see the smoke, that is normal. We've been touching the exhaust, there's oil everywhere. We haven't cleaned it yet. I like to assemble the engines just with a minimal amount of covers and stuff. Should there be a leak, you'll notice it. Should there be anything you forgot, we're not taking covers out again and everything. Plus, it helps with the cleaning. So here's the plan for this engine. We're gonna run it now, bleed it. Actually, have to rev up the engine to bleed it. If you want to see a 2GR FE bleeding with the hose and all that, I do have a video, I'll leave it up here. But we're gonna let it run, bleed the coolant. We're going to put everything back once we double check that there's absolutely no issues and nothing we need to come back to. And there's a lot of cleaning left. I do have to drill out the cotter pin holes because the cotter pins were completely rusted. We left that for now. We just wanted to make sure everything was good before we do that. Axle was fixed, so I'm happy with that. And then after all that is done, we put everything together, charge AC, go drive it. Likely we're going to need an alignment. We'll take care of that. And then few more test drives, few more checks, make sure nothing is leaking, nothing is out of the ordinary, and it's ready for, I hope, more than 100,000 miles. Folks, we fixed every single common problem with the Toyota V6. I know this sounds like a lot, but this is a very good engine. Revision 3 and up will have a lot less of these issues. So if you have one of those, let your blood pressure come back down. This is okay. This does happen. I know this can be scary, it's a massive job, but things happen, and now this engine I hope will run for a lot longer than it ran from when it was new. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.